All right, well, thank you for the song this morning, and hopefully smooth sailing from here on out. I know that's what everyone is used to, so we'll try our best to accommodate. All right, so we are still in Hebrews. We're going to Hebrews chapter 4. And as last Sunday, we're going to actually make some progress in Hebrews chapter this morning. So we're going to look here in this message at verses 1 to 5. This is message number 11 in the series in Hebrews entitled Believing is Believing. And we're going to look at, again, these first 5 verses. Let us therefore fear lest a promise being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. For unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. For we which have believed do enter into rest, as he said, as I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all his works. And in this place again, if they shall enter into my rest. So chapter 4 continues from chapter 3, and chapter 3 particularly had the quotation from Psalm 95. And the writer of Hebrews in chapter 4 is continuing to draw a very particular application from Psalm 95. And he began in chapter 3 with that comparison with Moses and Jesus and how the generation that Moses led out of Egypt failed to enter into the promised land of Canaan because of their unbelief. Now, in the previous 2 messages, we focused on the first verse here in chapter 4, and particularly the writer's statement that the promise of entering God's rest, that future rest, still remains. So we attempted to follow the writer's logic as he connected the promise of rest that remained to the promise given to that generation that came out of Egypt via the promise in David's day in Psalm 95. So that's sort of how he made those connections. And he focused particularly in Psalm 95 on the use of that word today and the concept that God said in Psalm 95 that while it is today, so the promise remained. And then he applied that term today to his readers in the first century, arguing that the promise still yet remains. Now, we also saw that his rest, the rest that's being spoken of in chapter 4, is not general, it's not generic, it's not just some sort of mystical, spiritual sort of thing. It's parallel with and inseparable from inheritance, possession, rest in the theological and the future sense. It involves both physical and spiritual aspects, and we noted a number of those. Physical aspects: inheritance in the earth, a blessed life in the kingdom, fruitful labor, rest from enemies and from the sin curse. And historically, this rest, this inheritance, this possession was defined for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Israel as the particular land of Canaan. The spiritual aspects we noted were eternal life in the future kingdom on earth, salvation from sin, righteousness entered, that this rest is entered after Israel's return and restoration, and entered after resurrection, and entered only by faith. Hence, why that generation was cut off, even though they were descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was because they didn't believe. So the writer repeatedly emphasizes in this passage that this rest, this promise still remains. Now, we need to proceed in this chapter and to see what all the writer is saying, because we did spend some time trying to establish for certain what is this promise that the writer is referring to that still remains. What does it entail? What does it involve? And I hope that we answered that question. Now, the chapter flows from this promised rest in Canaan to the creation, to Sabbath, to Jesus as great high priest, how are all of these things connected? If you just read through chapter 4 quickly, and you might even think by the end of chapter 4, oh, well, he's just changing subjects, but he's not. So how are all these things connected together? And we also still have an outstanding question about the nations, about the Gentiles, and what does this promise mean for them? Well, in verses 1 to 5, this writer begins with this warning to his readers, and the first step is discerning what this warning was really about. So we're going to look at verses 1 to 5, where the writer states explicitly that believers will enter rest. All right, so let's start with verse 1. Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. Now, we've already talked about in the previous messages, just there's a number of grammatical difficulties. It's just kind of a clunky sentence, and there's a number of different translations and ways that people have tried to smooth it out and to make it more readable. But I do believe that we're getting at the essence of what is being said here, and the therefore connects obviously back directly to chapter 3, particularly that conclusory verse in verse 19. So we see that that generation of Israel that came out of Egypt, could not enter into God's promised rest because of unbelief. They did not. They literally, physically did not enter the land of Canaan because of their unbelief. So, based on that, he says, let us therefore fear, and proceeds with the rest of the verse. They serve, that generation of Israel then serve as a negative example. And there are, of course, positive examples. Here's an example: be like this person, do like this person did. They're negative examples. Don't be like this. Don't do what this person did. Well, they're a negative example that continues throughout chapter number 4, and repeatedly the writer is going to emphasize, don't do what they did. They heard the promise, they heard the word, they gave a verbal assent to it, that they believed it, but in the end, they did not. They did not believe, and because of that, they would never enter into God's rest. So he tells us that this is to be feared. And note the use of us there. He says, let us. I mean, the writer is still including himself in this warning. Let us therefore fear. Who's he writing to? He's writing to those who have professed faith in Jesus Christ, particularly those first century Jews. According to chapter 2 and verse number 3, they were sort of a second wave of believers because they weren't eyewitnesses of Jesus, but they believed because they heard the gospel preached and the witness of Jesus from those that were eyewitnesses, the apostles and others. And he says, let us fear. And the idea here is there's a need to be careful. There's a need to be cautious. There's a need to be concerned about what we are doing here. And this is common in this letter, this need to be careful. And he says, of course, and we talked about this phrase, a promise being left us of entering into his rest, and how just the grammar just literally comes out like this, and it's just sort of difficult to follow. But we did. Essentially, the writer is saying that the promise of God's rest still remains. While this promise still remains, he's saying, we who have professed faith in Jesus Christ need to be careful about this. Now, he emphasizes that this promise remains here in verse 1, again in verse 6, in verse 9, in verse 11, 4 times in this passage, in particular verses 1 to 11, he emphasizes that this rest, this promise still remains. Now, we talked about rest, and we're not going to look at all of that again, but we established that rest is inseparably connected with inheritance in the earth, in passages like Deuteronomy chapter 3, verses 18 to 20, and Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 9 to 11. And that inheritance is actually thematic in Hebrews. In fact, we've already seen mention of it. In chapter 1 and verse number 14, the writer just quickly referred to the heirs of salvation, referring to an heir is someone who has an inheritance. They're heir to an inheritance. The believers that he was speaking of there in chapter 1. In chapter 9 of Hebrews, in verse 15, he'll refer to an eternal inheritance. And he also parallels this inheritance with the term promises in the letter to the Hebrews. And the Old Testament does the very same thing. Promises, which he says in chapter 6, verses 12 and 17, are confirmed by an immutable oath, unchangeable. These promises are unchangeable, inalterable. He also parallels it in chapter 12 and verse 28 with receiving the kingdom that cannot be shaken. And of course, in chapter 11, particularly in verses 13 and 39, points out how that Abraham and all of those others that he's referring to have not received it yet. So this is the promise that he is speaking of, this inheritance. And the warning that he's given is against them. Now, notice this last phrase, because it's another, again, that it's just kind of a difficult construction. Any of you should seem to come short of it. And if you compare different translations, you'll kind of see how they kind of take some different tracks. And the reason for that, and again, the King James here just comes across very, very literally. But many of the other translations, they take these different tracks because they're trying to bring out what they understand the meaning to be. They're trying to make that a little more readable. And so you'll kind of see some differences. I do think the King James is capturing it here by the use of that word seem. You should seem to come short of it. Because the word that is used here indicates seeming or supposing. So the warning is against them supposing themselves to have, and the word here for come short, the idea of come too late, or been excluded, or missing out. Don't suppose that you have missed it. One commentator, sort of trying to give his own original translation to the underlying Greek, put it this way: let us be careful that none of you suppose he has missed it. And again, I do think that does capture the sense. This gets at the heart of the issue and why in places later, like in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 36 to 37, why he's giving them assurance that Jesus will return. In other words, what we must do in this passage is sort of work backwards a little bit and to find out what's the trouble? What's the particular problem for these first century believers? What is it exactly that they're being tempted with? Because he does start talking about their temptations by the end of chapter 4, and no, that's not a change of subject. So what is it that they are being tempted with? Well, we put this together, and again, with reference by the end of chapter 4, we can discern that this troubling temptation for these first century Jewish believers was like the trouble for so many Jews in that time in particular, and even the apostles themselves prior to the ascension of Jesus and prior to Pentecost and the giving of the Spirit. They were struggling with the mystery of the kingdom. That's what they were struggling with. The mystery of the kingdom, of course, refers to the fact that the kingdom would not come with Messiah's first coming, but it comes in the future at the end of the age with his second coming. Now, we recently studied through Matthew and was looking at chapter 13. It has all those kingdom parables, and we noticed that common thread that ran through all of them. There was always this time element. There was always some sort of a delay in all of these parables, that something, it wasn't immediate, but it was something that was going to come after some time. And sometimes, like in the parable of the wheat and the tares, he actually says that it's the end of the world. It's the judgment, the end of the age, or it's the judgment when he comes and pulls those up. All of those parables had that common theme, that common element in it. There's a concept of waiting. There's a concept of delay. Now, just before entering Jerusalem, leading up to his death, just before entering Jerusalem, Jesus told a parable. And he told a parable as Luke captured it in Luke chapter 19 and verse 11, because they thought that the kingdom of God would immediately appear. Remember how that they were fighting amongst who was going to be greatest? They weren't, in their minds, they weren't fighting about what position they were going to have 2,000 years, thousands of years later at the end of the age, They thought the kingdom was immediately to appear. They thought that it was about to be here. And so they're arguing with each other about who's going to have the best place, the best role, the best position in that kingdom. So Jesus told that parable, just like he told them and revealed to them the mystery of the kingdom. And of course, the parable in Luke 19 is about the man who goes away for a long time into a far country, and he goes there to receive authority for his kingdom to return and rule. Well, after the resurrection, of course, the apostles asked Jesus directly, "Wilt thou at this time restore again the kingdom to Israel?" Acts chapter 1 and verse 6. So Jesus has resurrected. He's about to ascend into heaven. And in the apostles' mind, they're saying, okay, well, now is the time? They thought it was going to be, and then he died, and they were very confused by that as far as the sequence of events. Is it now that you're going to restore the kingdom? And of course, Jesus told them that that wasn't in their hands. That was in the Father's hands, and he ascended to heaven. And of course, it's obvious after that, the apostles did finally get the message. Because you turn over to chapter 3 in Acts, and Peter is preaching there in Solomon's porch, and he is referring to the fact that there is this delay. Acts chapter 3, verses 19 to 21. Well, the point of all this is that this was a very common problem for the Jews in that particular century. What are we going to do with Jesus? What about all these prophecies of the kingdom? I mean, Jesus came, but he was killed. Some say he was resurrected, but we're still under Roman rule. Our enemies haven't been destroyed and defeated. We've not been we've not inherited the entire land that has been promised. We're not reigning. So what do we think about this? So they were tempted to think that they had missed it, that they had missed the kingdom, the inheritance, the rest that was promised. They were subject to this thought in a few different ways, that the kingdom had already come and they had somehow missed it and found themselves outside of it. That the kingdom, in fact, would not come, that perhaps the promise didn't really mean a literal physical kingdom, but some sort of spiritual mystical thing. That the kingdom was yet to come, but following Christ wasn't the way. Following Christ would mean that they would miss it. And of course, this was further reinforced by some erroneous teaching in the first century, and we'll consider that somewhat later in the passage. Verse number 2, "For unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them. But the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it." Now, the word for gospel means good news. And every occurrence of this word doesn't necessarily mean what we narrowly refer to as the gospel when we're talking about the message of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Every use of the term doesn't mean that. In fact, one place where it doesn't is in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 6, when Paul refers to how that Timothy brought him the good news about the church in Thessalonica, exact same word that is used here and translated gospel. So we have to understand contextually. So contextually, what is the good news? And you can see they were sort of evangelizo. They were sort of evangelized as well as unto us. The good news was spoken to them. What good news is he talking about? Well, contextually, the good news here refers to the promise of rest. That was the good news that they heard in Egypt that he's talking about. That generation of Israel in Egypt, they heard this, and we looked at that in a previous message, Exodus chapter 2 and chapter 3 and chapter 4, some of those early chapters in particular. We looked at that word that was brought to Israel in Egypt, and that's what he's talking about, this promise of rest, this deliverance from bondage. They had been given a message that God had come down to visit them, to bring judgment on Egypt and to bring them into the land promised to their fathers according to his promises to Abraham. So just like Abraham, they were required to believe and obey. And of course, this is in Genesis 15:6, but the writer of Hebrews even points this out. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 to 19. There's several verses there about Abraham and the fact that he believed and obeyed. Well, the writer is sort of referring directly back to chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, because he says the gospel was for unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them, the good news. And we know back in chapter 2 and verses 1 to 4, he's talking about the good news of Jesus Christ, the good news, the message of Jesus Christ, the fulfillment of these promises that has come. Now, the word preached, he says, the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. The word for preached in this verse means just something heard, a message heard, a report heard. And it's actually the noun form of the word that is a verb translated heard right at the end of the sentence. In other words, those are the same word, one just in noun form, one in verb form. The point the writer is making is that hearing that message is not enough. Hearing that message is not enough. You have to believe. Hearing the good news and even being descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was not enough for that generation of Israel in Egypt to enter into the land of Canaan. And that is the point that he's making. Verse 3. For we which have believed do enter into rest, as he said, as I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. The beginning of this verse is in the present. We who believe. In other words, he's not making a reference to a past act of faith. He's saying we who believe enter into rest. The rest, of course, is future. And again, Abraham and all the others in Hebrews chapter 11. So the point that he's making about this belief and entering, it's not about the timing of the entering. It is about the necessary of faith to enter when that time comes. And this is actually the first of 4 quotes in verses 1 to 11 from Psalm 95. Again, we have the long quote back in chapter 3, and then he continues to pull from it here in chapter 4. And this is the first of 4 quotes from it in this passage. And he reiterates the fact that God swore a promise, an oath, that generation will not enter. And when you put this against the necessity of faith, he is highlighting that they didn't enter because of unbelief. This is why they didn't enter, and that is extremely important. In other words, they were excluded from God's rest because they did not believe. In chapter 3, he said they provoked, they sinned, and they were disobedient, and so they did not enter in because they did not believe. They didn't all die immediately, though. God swore they would never enter, and they didn't all die immediately. But they were all cut off. They were all excluded from his rest. And then, of course, they eventually all died in the wilderness as evidence of this fact and fulfillment of God's sworn promise. So what's the point he's making here? They failed. The promise didn't fail. God didn't fail. The promise didn't fail. They failed. And that's why they did not enter, because they did not believe. Well, then the writer goes on at the end of this verse, just all of a sudden, it seems like out of nowhere, he goes to creation, and that continues in the next verse as well. And again, what has this got to do with what he's saying? I mean, the foundation of the world that he speaks of is a common phrase in the New Testament in particular, and it refers to the creation as recorded in Genesis 1 and 2. And it's a common reference, again, in the New Testament and other places. Now, the word for finished here, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world, the word for finished appears nearly 30 times in Hebrews. And it means something done, something accomplished, something completed. And so here he's referring in particular to the creation work as being fully accomplished. God created the heavens and the earth, and he finished that work. He completed it. No more creative work for God to do. This is, of course, confirmed in the next verse. And verse 4, of course, continues about the creation, and then verse 5 is right back to Psalm 95. So in other words, either this is an entirely random insertion or rabbit trail by the writer, or it is connected exactly and precisely to what he is saying. And I certainly believe it's the latter. So look at verse 4. For he spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all his works. Now, he's quoting here from Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, and this is referred to later in Exodus in a couple places as well. God rested from all his works on the seventh day. Now, does that mean that God has taken no action since then? We just studied the book of Exodus, which gives us the revelation of probably the most revealed activity of God that we have in the Bible. So we certainly can't say that. God rested from all his works on the Sabbath day or the seventh day. What does that mean? It means that he rested from his creation works. And that he rested means that they were finished. He no longer has any of those to do. Those are finished. Those are completed. Those are accomplished. And then he says, God entered rest. So after the creation and before the fall, the earth existed in perfect harmony and rest. And from creation work and rest from sin, the earth had rest. God created the earth to be inhabited by mankind. We studied that in Psalm 115 and verse 16. And then he placed the man Adam in the garden to rule over the kingdom of the earth. And we've studied that in Genesis chapter 1, verses 28 to 30, as well as Psalm 8 in particular. So in other words, what the writer is referring to is that God's rest was here established. He had created the earth. He had made all of his works and pronounced them very good. He had achieved his purpose in creation. And he had created man and woman and had placed them in the garden and had put them over the works of his hands, over the creation, particularly of the earth, to have dominion, to rule over it. God's rest was established. But then, of course, we turn to Genesis chapter 3, and we know that that rest ended with man's sin. And so the process of God redeeming his creation and restoring his rest is unfolding throughout history. The reason the writer goes here is to show that God's promise of rest didn't originate in the wilderness, and neither did it end in the wilderness. It still remains. Why? Because it was older than the wilderness. Much, much older. That generation failed, but the promise didn't fail. It wasn't that God gave this promise, they failed to achieve it. Oh, well, that promise is over. And so now we'll just see what happens on the earth. No, this also shows us why that the promise itself is larger than just the nation of Israel. But his chosen nation promised to Abraham is extremely important in his plan of redemption, of his creation and the restoration of his rest in his kingdom on the earth. And we studied that recently in the covenants and other places as well. And then verse 5, and in this place again, if they shall enter into my rest. And this is right back to Psalm 95 verse number 11. They, that's that generation, shall not enter. And he's making a point here, and it comes out contextually in this passage. They shall not enter. He's emphasizing that. Why does he keep emphasizing they shall not enter? That God swore in his wrath, they shall not enter. And he keeps coming back to that and keeps coming back to that. Because the promise is, or the word there is not, no one shall enter. All right? We tried this. I gave you a promise. I gave you an opportunity of rest. You didn't believe, and so you're cut off and excluded. And so now no one gets, that's the way that us dads like to solve problems a lot of time in the family. All right, this kid messed up, so all of you are done. No more. That's it. I cannot confirm nor deny whether I have experienced that or perpetrated that, but nevertheless. But the writer's making the point here that that's not what happened. They would not enter. God said they would not enter. He didn't say no one would. So in other words, that means the promise still remains, which is what the writer has been emphasizing. The promise didn't fail. It hasn't been revoked. It still remains. So his argument continues even into the next verses, and he actually comes back to the creation rest as you proceed through this chapter, but we're going to stop here with verse 5, and then we'll pick up with verse 6 in the next message. So as we think about the opening part of this chapter, we should read this word to us. We should read this word. I mean, we're not first century Jews, obviously, but we read this word to us because the promise still remains. Why? How do we know that? Well, we know that because Jesus hasn't come back yet. This world is still continuing. This age is still going, and it will go until the end. We don't know the day or the hour of that end. We don't know when that will happen, but we have been told a lot that it will happen and things that are going to happen in connection with that. So the promise still remains, and it's larger than just Israel. And we'll see that more in the next part of this passage that we look at. But while it is today, the writer was picking up on that. While it is today, that's what David wrote in Psalm 95, even though he's 500 years after Moses. While it is today, he says, don't harden your hearts. Don't provoke the Lord. Don't sin like they did through unbelief. And the writer of Hebrews is picking that up and saying, it's still yet today. Don't suppose yourselves to have missed it. Don't suppose that you're on the wrong path to the kingdom because of Jesus, and you think that there's some other way, or you need to go back to the old covenant, which is obviously an issue in the rest of Hebrews. It is today, and that means that the promise of God's rest remains. And that also means you haven't been excluded. God said they would not enter the rest. The writer of Hebrews is saying, that's not you. That was them. God cut them off. Oh, yeah, many of them lived for nearly 40 years in the wilderness after that. They still died and did not enter. God said they were excluded. But also this, hearing this good news is not enough. Being children to parents who believe, it's just not enough. You and I, every one of us, personally, have to believe in Jesus Christ in order to enter into this future rest, to be saved, to have forgiveness and eternal life in Christ's kingdom. And so in that way, yes, this warning still applies to us. And those of us who have professed faith in Jesus Christ, we're also being told here, we need to be very careful. We need to be very careful that we go on believing. And we'll talk more about that in the next part of the passage. All right, that's all the message this morning. We will close with a hymn.